So you should be seeing the title page of the PowerPoint now. So I'm gonna get started and then pass it to Janelle for an overview of the Zoom functionality. Thanks for everybody for being here today. Sorry, I need to pull up my notes. I hope that everyone is safe and healthy as they can be, given everything that's been going on, including the wildfires in the state that have impacted communities across the state. I know that we've had people who had to evacuate or lost their homes, so I hope that you are doing as well as you can and have gotten the help that you need. Thanks for taking the time to be here today to talk about the STIF Discretionary and Safer Transit Network Fund programs. This is a solicitation training for those programs for fiscal year 2021 to 23. I'm Patrick DePriest. I'm the Intercommunity Program Coordinator with ODOT. Today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the STIF webpage at a later date, as will the PowerPoint slides. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Janelle jump in.
Hi folks, my name's Janelle and I'll be supporting a Zoom webinar today and making sure that I can help you resolve all of your technical issues as we use this platform to share information. So just as a couple of notes to give you an overview of what Zoom will look like today, you'll all be muted during the webinar and your video won't be showing up. So if you don't see your video on the side and you notice that you can't talk, that is okay. We're trying to reduce the amount of background noise to give as many people information as possible. So just as a note that you will be muted. However, there will be lots of opportunities for you to engage and ask questions. Throughout the webinar, we'll have designated opportunities for you to ask questions and share comments. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. So we'll have a Q&A box at the bottom. And if you look at the bottom of your Zoom, you can click on Q&A, and that's where you'll be able to submit questions throughout the webinar as they come up. So in our designated sections, we'll look at all of those questions that you've been building up throughout the webinar and make sure that we have opportunities to answer those questions either out loud or over the Q&A box by typing out our answers. So that's one option. And then if you have any technical issues and you need to reach out to figure out, how do I participate, what's going on, you can use the chat box. So again, that's at the bottom of your Zoom and you can click on chat and type a question directly to me, Janelle, or to everyone as well. And then finally, in the bottom, you'll also see, in addition to the chat and the Q&A, the raise hand feature. And so if you're having any issues submitting questions through the Q&A box, feel free to click raise hand. And when we come to those designated question sections, we will call on folks in order based on their raised hand. So that is how you'll use Zoom today, and feel free to reach out to me, Janelle, with any questions. I'm here to help you use Zoom to the best of your ability. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Janelle. And as Janelle noted, I'm going to pause at the end of the PowerPoint presentation for questions that are specific to the PowerPoint and the program background, and then I will take questions again at the end of the webinar after going through the application form itself. So now you should see an overview of the topics in today's webinar. We're going to talk about program background information, including program eligibility, the current fund availability estimates, the solicitation schedule. I will then provide some tips on writing compelling project descriptions, which is question 16 of the application. And finally, we'll take a closer look at some of the questions within the application form itself to offer clarity on how to best complete those. So the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, or STIF discretionary programs, first you have the discretionary fund, which represents 5% of the STIF disbursement, and the project eligibility for this program is broad, except that it's not a source of ongoing operation funding, and neither of the STIF discretionary programs may be used for light rail capital. Past projects from the STIF Discretionary program have included pilot services, technology projects, fleet expansion, and other projects. Then we have the Statewide Transit Network program, which is made up of two fund sources. First, it's made up of the STIF Intercommunity Discretionary Fund Source, which is 4% of the total STIF disbursement. And the focus of this fund is to improve coordination between providers and fill gaps in the statewide transit network. Also part of the statewide transit network fund program is the FTA Section 5311F intercity bus program, which is focused on long distance intercity services that are not primarily designed to serve commuters. So within the application form itself, applicants can apply to be considered for one, two, or all three of these fund sources. I'm going to go over applicant eligibility and how it differs between the programs. For both of the STIF fund sources, so for both discretionary and intercommunity discretionary, the applicant eligibility is the same. The applicant must be a public transportation service provider, which is a term that was defined in statute. And this includes the list of entities that you see here in the first sub-bullet. And that is found, as I said, both in statute and in the OARs themselves. So while nonprofits and for-profits are not included in that list, direct recipients of these funds may contract with nonprofits and for-profits and other entities to complete project deliverables. Under FTA Section 5311F, applicant eligibility is broader. It includes nonprofits and for-profits as well as the entities that are listed above. And the difference being, again, that 5311F has sort of a more narrow project eligibility that goes into it. This chart shows the estimated fund availability for these fund programs. So currently, we're showing a 9.5 million disbursement for the STIF Discretionary Fund and 9.5 million for the Statewide Transit Network Program, with 7.6 of that coming from the Intercommunity Discretionary Fund and 1.9 coming from the Section 5311F funds. These estimates could decrease or increase as a result of the loss or gain in projected STIF tax revenue. However, the project ranking system that we use to evaluate the applications ensures that the best scoring applications will be funded first in the event that the actual STIF tax revenue falls short of these projections. Also important to note is that these estimates assume no legislatively directed backfill for the 2021-2023 Special Transportation Fund, or STF, which did happen during the 2019-2021 biennium. So another thing to remember is that that ODOT has now been directed to combine the STF and the STIF programs starting in the 2023-2025 biennium. Here you'll see a solicitation schedule for this application. The notice of solicitation did go out on September 4th, with applications being due on November 2nd of this year. After we receive the applications in early November, they will go through eligibility review and both for project and for applicant eligibility. And then in December, the applications will be shared with the ACTs and the QEs for those that are appropriate to the application. So depending on the ACT or the QE's area of responsibility, they'll receive applications relevant to those and have the opportunity to provide feedback and or a funding recommendation on those applications. Then in January, the ODOT Project Selection Committee will score the applications, and in February they will meet to determine a final funding recommendation to share with PTAC. PTAC will review these applications, or review the funding recommendations in early March, with the Commission reviewing PTAC's funding recommendation in March or April, depending on timing. That will then give time for ODOT staff, including the regional transit coordinators, to prepare the grant agreements and the statements of work that are relevant to those grant agreements in order to have an execution date of July 1st, 2021. Now I'm going to provide some tips on writing compelling project descriptions. This slide pertains to question 16 of the application. The project description was an area of these applications that was targeted for improvement in fiscal year 2021-23. Last biennium, ODOT received several applications that had either vague details about the proposed project or appeared to describe transit service generally with no identifiable project deliverables. So here are a few tips for writing compelling and successful project descriptions. First, stick to explaining what the project or service is or will be. So give us the what and the where and the how of the project rather than the why. Avoid focusing on the benefits of the project beyond providing context for the service. So of course, it might make sense to set the scene by identifying the need for the project. For example, a project description might begin by describing existing demand for a service that would be a pilot service that does not exist yet. However, questions 22 and questions 24 through 32 of the application provide ample space to express the benefits of the proposed project. And so those questions 24 through 32 relate directly to the selection criteria, those 6 selection criteria for these projects. So instead, here in question 16, tell the selection committee the details of the proposed project, such as the municipalities the service will visit, or the planning activities necessary to get the project off the ground. When it comes to asset purchases, be specific. What size and type of vehicle will you purchase? What types of signs and infrastructure will be used to improve transit stops, for example. Provide detail that will make it easier for the evaluation team to connect the dots between your project description and the cost that you identify in the project detail section, which is essentially your budget section. So for example, what operations activities are anticipated to be supported with the grant award? And by providing that kind of clear detail that ties it to the budget, you really help the reviewers to get a better understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. So finally, this response box has been expanded to 5,000 characters, I think from around 2,000 characters last biennium, to provide additional space for detail. So here are those 6 selection criteria. I wanted to put them on a slide, but I'm not going to review them in depth today. This same content is found in a similar chart on page 14 of the program guidance document. So the project selection criteria are used to score the applications and are weighted differently under the STIF Discretionary program versus the statewide transit network program, as you see there on the right side of this chart. And that reflects the different purposes and goals of the 2 fund programs. So for example, you'll see that the coordination of public transportation services, the 2nd row, and the statewide transit network connections, which is the 5th row, are both weighted more heavily for the statewide transit network program as it relates more closely with the goals of the program. So neither the selection criteria nor the associated program weights have changed from last biennium, so that remains the same. So that's it for the program background content. You'll see here a list of key topics that I'm going to address directly when we pull up the application form itself. But I wanted to give some time now to have attendees ask any questions that they had about the previous PowerPoint slides, so specific to the program background.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A section, so I can read them out loud and we can answer them live. Does that work for you, Patrick?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Great. All right, our first question is, when will the qualified entities receive the applications back from ODOT to present them to the STFAC for their input?
So eligibility review should be completed by before Thanksgiving. So it should be no later than the first week of December that that the qualified entities and the ACTs should receive the applications relevant to their areas of responsibility, and they will have December and January to get that feedback back to ODOT.
Great, thank you. Our next question from Susan. Can you provide more information about whether nonprofits can be a direct recipient under FTA Section 5311?
So I can't say that I am the best expert on exact eligibility rules for 5311F, but I know that a nonprofit service providers are eligible to receive 5311F funds. For example, last biennium, Community Connection for Northeastern Oregon received a 5311F grant directly. I know that we have, I don't know if this person is looking for additional detail. One moment. I know that we have Frank on the line, and perhaps he would like to unmute himself and add more. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what this question is looking for.
So, yes, this is Frank. I can confirm that we have a nonprofit recipient who is a direct recipient of Section 5311F funding. The only thing I would caution is that if last cycle is any indication, 5311F was pretty heavily oversubscribed, which is why we blended in the STIF Intercommunity Fund. We didn't necessarily tell an applicant which fund they would receive when they applied. I think we worked with Matthew Barnes to do the best job we could of matching up needs with available resources. Does that help?
I think that is helpful. Thank you, Frank. And I would just add that remember that the Section 5311F intercity funds are much more strictly tied under their project eligibility. So it's specifically long distance, non-commuter type trips. So it's not a fund source that's available for just any type of project, unlike STIF Discretionary, which has a much broader eligibility.
Correct. And because it's Section 5311 money, all the drug and alcohol components apply. Yeah, it's also a pretty steep match rate. It's like a 50-50 match rate. So it's not for everybody.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. And I believe we have one more question from John in the chat. What is the process for determining the funding source to be selected for a project when an applicant notes more than one eligible funding source? For example, both intercommunity and 5311F ? Do any parties make a recommendation for the funding source that is considered by PTAC?
So I am going to cover this, I think, when I go through the application form itself, but just as a quick answer, you will be able to indicate not only the different fund sources that you wish to be considered for, but also you can indicate a preference of which you would hope to receive. Now, again, that preference won't be guaranteed, but that's part of what goes into deciding where projects end up, and the other piece is the scoring system. So the projects that score higher will get moved into their preferred funding category, for example. But when we get into the application form, I think you'll be able to see how you can get more information on that.
It looks like David might have a comment on that piece as well.
David Graff.
Yeah.
Okay.
David, did you want to add anything, or I can just read out what you said in the chat?
I can say it for everybody's benefit. I just wanted to clarify that the 5311F recipients would be ODOT subrecipients, not specifically direct FTA recipients of 5311F funds.
That's a really good clarification. Thank you, David. You know, I think we get that mixed up when it's money that's coming from the federal government versus from the state. So right, we're technically ODOT is the direct recipient, and then subrecipients are those who apply through us. And I think I was going to add something. Oh no, I don't think I was going to add anything else.
Well, that is it for questions that we have so far. And for folks who joined us a little later, feel free to type your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get to them later on. So thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Janelle. Okay, I'm going to click our link here for the application form. And I need to pull it over here. All right, so now everyone should be able to see the application form. I've zoomed in on it a little bit so that it's easier for you to see. One moment. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out, and bear with me while I scroll through this, is at the bottom of the form on the right side, you'll see a save button. So this allows you to save the application at any time while working on it. When you do, I'll go ahead and show you, it pulls up this box and provides you either a link to your specific application that you're working on that you can copy and share with yourself or others, or you can have the Cognito email you that link here by putting your email in. So as soon as you hit that, your progress has been saved, so it doesn't require sending it yourself to yourself for it to be saved. But this is an important note that the form does not auto-save. So if you were to close out of your tab, or if your internet was to crash while you were working, you would lose the changes that came from your last save. So it's a reminder to save often. After you have gotten your link, the link will not change. So if you do some more work and then you come back and hit save, you don't need to recopy the link. It's saved at that same link address. So I just wanted to cover that really quick before I go into some of the content. So the first thing I want to talk about is here at the top of the application. It's a disclaimer that's added up here, and it says, each application seeking operating funding should only include one transit service. ODOT will not review an application for operating funds that pertains to more than one transit service, but applicants may submit multiple applications. So this disclaimer should communicate that where an application seeks operating costs, which is important to remember that it's specific to that, for a transit service, that application should only include one service, which might also be described as one route. For example, last biennium, Tillamook County Transportation District applied for operating funds for its service to Salem and separately applied for its service to Portland. So Tillamook County correctly kept those two service routes in two separate applications. The reason for this is that the applications will be tied directly to the grant agreements that are created, and so we want to have one service in there because when we ask for reporting through the agency periodic report or the APR, we ask for service data such as ridership, revenue miles, revenue hours. And if we don't have the grant agreement limited to one service route, then we can't discern where those numbers are coming from if there are multiple services included. So if you have additional questions about that, please reach out to me or your regional transit coordinator for clarity. But to add more clarity, this rule does not bar transit providers from collaborating as applicants on a new or improved service. So you could have an applicant that is, say, the main recipient, and then has subrecipients that are other providers that are providing a different piece of the service. that's fine. It also does not bar an applicant from bundling other types of project expenditures, even where those costs might pertain to multiple transit services. So an example would be bus stop improvements. An applicant could seek funding for multiple bus stop improvements in one application, even where those bus stops are used by different service routes. So hopefully that provides some clarity on that disclaimer. Okay, so I am going to move on to question 3. And just for everyone's knowledge, at the end of this section of the webinar, you'll be able to ask questions about any of the questions in the application, not just the ones that I'm covering specifically. So question 3 asks, would this award support ongoing operations of an existing service? So answer yes to this question if the service existed in any form during the previous biennium. So we will select yes. When you do that, you'll see that the application form populates 2 additional boxes to ask for more information. First, question 3A asks for the operation costs of the previous quarter. So this question is asking for the cost from the fiscal quarter beginning in July 2020. So that's the most recent quarter before the applications are due. However, if the applicant believes that a different quarter more accurately reflects what the operating costs will be for that target service come July 2021, when the new fiscal year begins, it may input those costs instead. So this could take into consideration, for example, pre-COVID operating costs. But if you're not going to input the most recent quarter of costs, please indicate which quarter your cost figure is coming from in question 3B. Unfortunately, we aren't able to put non-numeric text in 3A, so I can't add it there, but let's just say that your operation costs are $150,000 for the previous quarter. If you're going to put it, if those costs came from a different quarter than the most previous, you put that here. So you'd say past operations costs from, say, July through October of 2019 quarter. So that's just an example of how you do that. So for question 3B, which says, give us a brief history of the current project or service. What, if any, elements of the proposed project differ from existing efforts and services? For this question, tell the selection committee about the existing service and any changes that the applicant seeks to make to the service during the upcoming biennium if funded. So for example, will the service be expanded to new destinations? Will the provider increase the frequency of the service? Are there no planned changes for the service? 3B is really essential to help the selection committee understand the proposed project within the context of the currently available service. And since you did see that this is asking about ongoing operations, this question is also relevant to eligibility for these fund programs. Okay, I'm going to move on to question 14 next on my list. Question 14 says, if you seek the 10% match reduction, does the project meet one or more of the 4 factors identified in this OER? Select each factor that you believe is exemplified by the proposed project. So this is the first of 2 questions in the application that are relevant only to the STIF program and not to the 5311F program. The STIF program does have a 10% match reduction possibility where projects meet one of the 4 factors listed in the OERs, and those are also summarized here. So if you were applying only for 5311F or not applying for the 10% match reduction, you would select that here. If you were, though, and we'll, for the sake of today, we'll say that we as an applicant believe that the service serves an area outside the applicant's geographic jurisdiction, you'd click that. And that's important. And you can also click more than one. So you could say, I think it also fills a significant gap in the statewide transit network. And it's important, for question 14 is important in that sense because when you select one of these 4 factors, that will impact what you see in terms of your match in your budgeting table area. So we'll leave that as is. Questions 17 and 18 are the next ones on my list, and those ones are also specific to STIF rules. So it asks what local plans include this project or elements of the project. Be specific in the citation of local plans. So while it is specific to STIF, if a 5311F only applicant can point to a local plan that references the proposed service, please indicate that here. So STIF requires that a project is referenced or appears in a local plan. Local plans include a range of planning documents, such as transportation system plans, transportation development plans, and transit master plans. Also, policies adopted by QEs and other, qualified entities, for those who don't know what QE stands for, and other relevant entities might also act as local plans for the purpose of this requirement. So we're providing a specific plan or policy title here, as well as a link to the document if it exists online, and specific page numbers where the references to the project can be found, makes it much easier for the regional transit coordinators to ensure project eligibility during eligibility review. And note that a project does not necessarily have to be listed explicitly in a plan. The completion of a goal listed in a local plan, such as improving the safety of pedestrians in and around transit stops, for example, could be sufficient to confirm project eligibility. So all of this information, by the way, is included in program guidance. I'm reiterating it here because obviously you don't have a slide to take home from this part of the presentation today, but these are just areas I'm really trying to highlight to create clarity and to help create great applications that are clear to the readers. The next questions I want to talk about were referenced in our Q&A for the first section, which is selecting the fund sources. So question 20 says, select the fund source or sources for which you would like to compete and that you believe your project is eligible to receive. Check all that apply. So where possible, an applicant should only select the fund sources for which it is eligible, but an applicant can apply for 1, 2, or all 3 of the fund sources represented here. Note that an applicant will only be considered for the fund source or sources selected in this question. If you have questions about eligibility, reach out to your regional transit coordinator about that. For the purposes of today, we'll just select intercommunity discretionary and FTA and take off discretionary. So question 21 adds a new feature to the application. Applicants can rank the fund sources they have selected by order of preference. Where the applicant has no preference on a fund source, they can select no preference. So we're going to go ahead and select no preference for STIF discretionary because we're not applying for that. And then let's say we'd prefer to have STIF intercommunity discretionary over FTA section 5311F. So we'll put 1 for IC, and then we'll put 2 for section 5311F. You could also, though, say that you have no preference and just put no preference for everything. So I think this starts to get at the question that was asked in the Q&A about where projects end up in terms of fund source. First, you provide the fund sources you would like to apply for, then you provide the preferred ranking. Again, your preference will be considered by the selection committee, but does not guarantee that you're funded under that program. Really what it comes down to is how well your application scores based on the relevance of the project described to the project selection criteria. And then that will determine where projects end up. So as I noted before, here's question 22, which asks, why is this an important project? And then we get to 24 through 32, which are connected to the OTC investment priorities, which are also the project selection criteria. So those are all housed in 24 through 32. And so those are a really important place to tell us the why. why is this project helpful in the ways that these questions are asking? And to provide good detail there will help you get a better score, because these are directly tied to the scoring. So finally, I'm going to talk about the project details section. And so this is essentially your budgeting section. This is where you'll identify the anticipated costs for the proposed project. The costs from each task category selected will be automatically added to provide grant and match totals for the application. So your costs, you'll identify total task costs in each task category that you choose, and those totals will then be added up down here in the application totals section. So for the purposes of our example, let's do a vehicle purchase and operating. So you'll notice that when you select a task category, the form will create new sections that tie directly to those categories. So now we see vehicle purchase here, now we see operating here. If we were to take operating check away, that would go away. So let's start with a vehicle purchase. I'm going to do a vehicle replacement example. I'm not going to enter the information for all of these categories, but I will kind of give you a sense of what the section is looking for. So first, the section asks about the vehicles to be replaced. Some of these cells are drop-down cells. So for example, the vehicle ALI, you can select the vehicle type, or the fuel system, you can select the fuel system type. Whereas other ones, such as the make and model, are cells that you type into. An important thing to note on the vehicle replacement piece is entering your VIN. Make sure that you enter an accurate VIN number, and make sure that your VIN here is tied to your VIN here that you enter for condition of the vehicles. So for any of the asset related pieces of the budget, you can add an item by clicking this. So say you had two vehicles you wanted to replace, you'd add item, you'd enter all the information, including the VIN, and then you'd move on to condition. Say you decide, okay, actually I only want to replace one vehicle. You can click this X to the left of here to get rid of that row. So after you have entered the information that's required here, and note that any cell that has an asterisk is required for the application to be able to submit. After that section, you'll go on to the condition of the vehicles. Again, you'll match the VIN to the VIN you provided above, and then you'll give us the condition of that vehicle. There are the 4 different condition statuses. There's a document that is linked in the program guidance that helps you to determine what the vehicle condition is. And then you explain the vehicle maintenance history, any right sizing, justification that's relevant, or other information about the vehicle that's being replaced. Moving on, the form asks, will you use the state price agreement contract? You can select yes or no, and if you select no, essentially the form asks why, but we'll just select yes. And then finally, you've moved on to vehicles to be purchased. So again, it's going to ask you for the vehicle ALI. We'll just say a 30-foot bus. It'll ask you for other information, including the quantity. So say you wanted one bus, and say for the ease of today, that bus costs $100,000. You'd enter that, and then you'd see that your grand total has become $100,000, which is also now your total task cost here. So this is where you're going to look for the task cost that's going into your application totals. So for example, if you were to switch this to 2, if you wanted to purchase 2 new buses, you'd see that all of the totals would switch to 200,000. We're going to stick with 1, and then we're going to get into some of the other questions that this section asks, including about match. So next, the form asks, are matching funds available if the project is awarded? So importantly, at the bottom of each task category, section, you'll see that the form has calculated match for that section cost. So here we're looking at STIF intercommunity and FTA 5311F. And you'll note that the match amount is the same for a vehicle purchase under each of these programs. So it's a 20% match rate calculation. So in that case, you as applicant would be responsible for $20,000 in match, and the grant amount would be $80,000 just for this task. If you were to be awarded the 10% match rate calculation, that too is shown here. And of course, your match amount would be $10,000 and your grant amount would be $90,000. And now note that this 10% match rate calculation will not show up unless you have answered question 14 that we looked at above, saying that you believe that your project meets one of the factors listed there. So we had a question that said, are matching funds available if the project is awarded? So for the purposes of that, we'll say, yes, we can match the $20,000 amount. Then the form asks, what % of funds will be used for demand response transportation? And this is tied then directly to this calculation here for % of funds to be used for fixed route transportation. So this might be relevant, say, if you were only purchasing a vehicle and you thought, well, this vehicle is probably going to be used for both fixed route and for demand response. You could say, we think it'll be about 50-50. So if you enter a 50% here, you'll notice that the fixed route transportation quantity also switches to 50. For today, we're just going to stick with 0 and 100. And we're going to move on to operations. So scrolling down, you'll see the operating is still here waiting for you. This section, along with a couple of the other task categories, are much more straightforward than the vehicle replacement and vehicle expansion task categories. It just asks simply for the total task cost. So we're going to enter in 100,000, and do remember, this is important, that whenever it asks for the total task cost, it's talking about both the grant amount and the match amount combined. So that's your total project cost. Again, it asks, are matching funds available? And it asks what % of these funds will be used for demand response. So this should typically be the same. Now, notice here that there's a new match rate calculation available because under 5311F, the operating match rate requirement is 50%. So you'll see that for a 5311F applicant, your match amount requirement would be $50,000 for this operating cost and $50,000 for the grant amount. You still do see the 20% match rate calculation and the 10% match rate calculation below. Okay, so finally, we're going to move on to the application total section. First of all, below you're going to see the application totals that are the combined totals for the task categories that we have completed above. Now, I wanted to do a 5311F example today because of an error in the Cognito form. Essentially, the form does not allow us to create an application total using two different match rates. So under 5311F, if you have operating and you have another match or another match rate under a different task, you will have a 50% and a 20% match rate that are in the same application. So bear with me as I kind of explain further what these numbers are showing there. So for 5311F, you'll notice that it correctly shows us that our match amount requirement is under 50% match is 50,000 and our grant amount is 50,000. However, the 20% and the 10% match rate calculations calculate for the entire project cost. So you'll see that these combine to make 200,000 a piece, whereas this is only the 10,000. So importantly, if you're applying for 5311F and you need to get a sense of your application total under that program, you need to ensure that you've entered the correct amounts in your task categories, because that's what we're going to rely on to see what your match amount and your grant amount would be for those programs. Do note that for the STIF programs, there are no issues because there's a flat match rate calculation across the board, regardless of the task category. So if you were just applying for STIF money, then these calculations are done correctly by the form. We've added an additional disclaimer here about this inability of the form to split match rate for 5311F, just for your reminder, and please reach out with any questions on that. And sorry for any inconvenience that creates. So going back to the beginning of this section, it asks for the match sources. So this section requests information about the sources of match, whether that be from federal, state, or local. And you can indicate multiple sources by clicking the Add Sources button. So let's just go ahead and say, okay, we have federal match available, but we also have local match available. So it's again an example of a place where you can add a line if you need it, or you can remove it. Today we'll keep it on there. So we'll just use this STIF 20% match rate calculation as our example. So you're going to enter here the amount of match available from each source for the project. So since we have a $40,000 match amount requirement, we'll just say, okay, well, there's 20,000. We have 20,000 available in federal match and 20,000 available in local match. Now, this amount does not have to be exactly the match rate calculation shown here. You can indicate, for example, that you have additional match available. So you could say, well, actually, we have 40,000 in federal match, and that just shows that you have additional match available for the project, and could be relevant if, say, you were applying for 5311F as well. So that's it for the content of the form itself. You go to the bottom, again, here's that Save button. You may also upload documents here. When you click on this button, it'll open your file directory, and you can upload local plans, schedules, maps, other information that supports or adds context to your application. You can also, and then once you're done with everything, you hit Submit Application here. Now the form will stop you if you haven't entered a piece of required information in the form, and you have to complete that before submitting. Once you're fully done, you hit Submit, and the notice of the submittal will come both to ODOT and to you by email, and then you will also be able to download your application in PDF form at that time. Okay, so I'm going to leave the application form open for now, in case we need it, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. Those could be about program background, or they could be about questions I didn't cover in the application, or they could be about questions I did cover in the application. And I may need to call on people such as David and Frank, where they might have helpful input. So Janelle, take it away.
Yeah, we have some great questions, and I'll read them in order, and feel free to come in as Patrick is answering them. So our first question is from Jeff Hazen. How will the committee address COVID-19 impacts to existing services that may be seeking continued funding?
So it's a great question, Jeff. Obviously, it's, COVID has had relevance to all of our fund programs at this point and will continue to do so. We had established essentially a set of conditions that would be needed to extend an application or extend a grant that already exists. And, I think that there's a lot of considerations that go into that. Obviously, we would be entertaining projects that are continuing projects, but again, this is going into a competitive process, so all projects will be scored equally, regardless of whether they were in existence during the 2019-2021 biennium. I would like to, though, if she's still here, ask Marcia to talk on this as well. because I think she might have additional input.
Okay, so you're asking me to weigh in on existing services?
Yes, and you know, we can talk about how that's relevant to the formula program as well.
So I'm trying to think of what I can add to what you already said. We did, I mean, all projects will be evaluated competitively. We did determine that we would not necessarily give any particular priority to, and this is true anytime there's a discretionary solicitation. We try and score them on the merits as opposed to giving them what I want to say, extra points because they're continuing service. And so I think the same is true with COVID-19 type projects.
That's great. And I mean, I just think that Jeff, it certainly would be relevant to, in question 3 and in other parts of the application, indicate the fact that this was a project that was impacted by COVID or that already existed in the past biennium, because that'll be very relevant to the review of the project and, you know, our understanding of what's trying to be accomplished.
Yes, absolutely. It's a factor to consider, right? And actually making a decision that would not fund any kind of service currently in play would be something we would take somewhat seriously. So while, as I said, we don't necessarily add points or preference to that, Patrick's right, it should be noted so that we're aware of the project and the implications around funding it.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our next question from Anne McCracken. We are doing one technology grant for bus stop e-readers and one board destination signage project, I believe. Both are electronic signage. Is the recommendation good for one grant or should we submit 2 separate ones?
Great question, Anne, and you could submit that in a single application.
Thank you. Question is from Troy Rayburn. Can you use a planning example and what is covered?
Sure. So I think that you are probably talking about the planning task category. And I think it should be relatively straightforward. Here, let's get rid of the other ones because they're just going to knock it up a little bit. Right. So this is just like operating. It only asks you directly for the task cost and the other information that you saw under operating. Where you'd want to really get into what the planning is going to involve is in question 16, which is your project description. And then, of course, into the benefits of the planning in questions 22 and 24 through 32.
Great. Thank you. And folks, if we didn't cover your question completely, put in clarifying questions, but that looks great. Our next question is from Melissa Metz. If a bus will be used for a deviated fixed route, is that 100% fixed route?
That's correct. Great question. Thank you, Melissa.
Our next question is from Sarah Hackett. Provided I understood the form, what would happen on the form if the applicant selects no to the question whether local match funds are available?
And I think that Sarah means any match funds, not just local match funds. But so if you are to select no, then that could be relevant for a few different reasons. If you say you were only applying for STIF and you said no, we can't meet the 20% match, you know, that could cause some concern in terms of being able to fund that award if you weren't able to make match. But it also, you know, flags that for the regional transit coordinator so that they can communicate with that applicant, you know, go to whichever regional transit coordinator is relevant for the applicant. and see, you know, where areas of match might be available for them, whether they can use in-kind or something like that. Additionally, I think it's relevant if you have different match rate calculations here. So say that you could meet the match if you were awarded for operating under STIF, which is a 20% match, but you could not meet it if you were awarded under 5311F, which is a 50% match rate calculation. You would say no there. We had considered adding an additional box to explain the no, and I think that there was a good reason for not including it, but you can explain in question here, questions 30 and 31, which are the funding and strategic investment project selection criteria. So 30 asks how the match requirements will be met or exceeded. It essentially asks about your match, where it's coming from, and 31 asks if this project is going to continue in the next biennium, describe the plan for ongoing match. So this is an area where if you're concerned about your ability to meet match for the project, you could provide that information.
Thanks, Patrick. Sarah says, thanks. And our next question is from Melissa Metz. Can you use Local 5311 for a match to a discretionary STIF project?
Let me think. I believe the answer is yes. Frank and or Teresa, will you correct me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, so the statewide transportation improvement fund is state money and could be used to match your 5311 project, but you'd probably want to work carefully with your regional transit coordinator. Make sure you understand everything that is in your statement of work and that we've got good compatibility between the projects that you're trying to leverage.
And so I think they've asked for the other way around. Can you use 5311 for STIF match? And I think the answer is still yes.
Yes, one can match the other. But again, please work carefully with your RTC to make sure that your statement of work is going to be compliant with the other statement of work and that you're leveraging compatible projects.
Thank you, Frank.
All right, we have one more question. Folks can continue to submit them if you have any outstanding questions, but this last one so far is from John Allen. Can you show us the scoring system that will be used?
So I can't show you the Excel form itself that kind of finalizes the scoring, but if we jump back onto our PowerPoint, I'll just go back to our project selection criteria. I feel like it might be the easiest place to explain how this works. So in the application itself, there are questions that pertain to each of these 6 project selection criteria that you see here on the left column. The evaluators on the selection committee will score each application to those 6 criteria, and I believe it will be, they'll provide a number 1 through 20 for each score. That score will then be multiplied against these percentages that you see on the right side columns. So if you've applied for, say, all 3 fund sources, then your score for each of these project selection criteria will be, for example, equity as our first selection criteria. That score would be multiplied against 20% and 10%, meaning that it's going to have a heavier impact on your score for STIF discretionary than for your score for the statewide transit network. So that's kind of an overview of how scoring works. Once all of those calculations are done, then we stack the application scores against each other in a ranking system, which then goes in front of the selection committee, and we finalize that fund. Based on that, we finalize a funding recommendation for PTAC.
Excellent. That is our final question in the Q&A. If folks are having issues with Q&A, feel free to raise your hand or drop in the chat, but I think that covers it.
yeah, if people have a question that they don't know how to type, as Janelle said, you can ask it verbally.
Yeah, we can leave a couple moments for any raise hands. Yeah, I see one raised hand from Ray Nielsen. So Ray, I will unmute you.
Will your presentation slides be made available to the participants?
Yes, yeah, they're going to be uploaded to the STIF website and
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ray. And I don't see any final hands. So thanks for covering everything so thoroughly, Patrick.
Thank you, Janelle. And thanks everybody for being here today. Feel free to reach out to me and or your regional transit coordinators. And if you need their contact, you can reach out to me for that. About any further questions that you have about the solicitation. And we look forward to seeing all the applications in early November.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye all.